When mechanic Kate Rhea bought an old, forgotten bunker for next to nothing, she never imagined it would lead her to a discovery that would change her life and history forever. What started as a routine project quickly turned into an extraordinary journey as she uncovered gold bars hidden for decades and worth millions. But the true price of this discovery may cost more than she could have ever imagined. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this excite you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will uncover an even deeper mystery you won't want to miss. Let's get started. Kate Rhea was no stranger to the overlooked and forgotten. As a mechanic, her world was filled with the remnants of discarded machinery, rusting cars, and abandoned warehouses. But the bunker she stumbled upon, sitting quietly beneath the overgrown trees of an old estate, was different. She had no idea it would be her biggest discovery yet. The estate, long since abandoned, had been the talk of the town for years. No one knew exactly what lay behind its crumbling walls and boarded-up windows. Local legends swirled around the place, stories of wartime treasures, hidden secrets, and a life left frozen in time. To Kate, it had always seemed like nothing more than a decaying relic, an eyesore on the edge of town. But when a real estate auction offered the property for a fraction of its value, her curiosity got the better of her. She had come for the land, the tools, and maybe a few leftover pieces of scrap to tinker with. But as soon as she stepped into the overgrown garden and caught sight of the rusted steel doors set into the ground, something inside her shifted. It didn't look like any standard storage unit. No, this was something far more hidden, far more deliberate. Her fingers traced the edges of the door, cold and metallic beneath the dirt and grime. The faint sound of a distant crow echoed in the stillness as she knelt down, pulling back moss and twisted vines. The bunker had been sealed for decades. No one had dared enter. But the lock, it was easy enough to break. Kate took a deep breath and used her tools to pry it open. The door groaned, but it gave way with a sharp screech. As it swung open, she felt a rush of cold air rush from inside, the smell of stale earth and something heavier, older. A glimpse of a dim, underground passageway greeted her eyes. Her heart raced. Was it a storage room? A forgotten hideout? Or something even more mysterious? She grabbed her flashlight and stepped inside. The beams of light bounced off concrete walls, revealing large crates stacked haphazardly along the walls, their labels long since faded. But it was the piles of strange metal objects piled in the center of the room that caught her attention. They were shaped like bars, heavy and stacked together, but they didn't look like any ordinary metal. There was a shine to them, a strange luster that made her pause. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved closer, bending down to inspect. The metal was heavy and cold, with strange markings etched into the surface. She took a closer look. Her flashlight illuminated something she'd never expected to find: swastikas carved into the sides of the bars, along with markings in German. "Gold," she whispered under her breath, her voice almost lost in the thick, damp air. This is Nazi gold." Her pulse quickened, 1,000 questions running through her mind. What was this doing here? Why had it been hidden away? And how had it survived all these years, untouched by time or the world outside? Kate knelt beside the pile, her fingers brushing against the cold, gleaming gold. The weight of the discovery hit her like a truck. This wasn't just any treasure, it was history, buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for someone to uncover it. But as she sat there, mesmerized by the gold, something nagged at the back of her mind. She wasn't the only one who had found this place. What if there were others who had been searching for the same thing? And if so, what did that mean for her? As she sat there in the silence of the bunker, the weight of the discovery settled in. This was just the beginning. But one thing was clear. Kate's life had just taken an unexpected turn. Kate had never expected to find something like this, but as she sat surrounded by piles of Nazi gold, she couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on her. Each bar seemed to whisper a forgotten story, a tale of power, war, and betrayal. The thought that she was the first to discover it was both exhilarating and terrifying. She stood up slowly, running her fingers along the edge of one of the gold bars. The cold metal sent a shiver through her, and for a moment she imagined the men who had buried it here, their faces grim with secrets they would take to their graves. How had they known? How had they managed to hide something so valuable, so dangerous, from the world for so long? With her mind racing, Kate decided she needed answers. But first, she needed to get out of this dark, eerie place. She backed away from the pile of gold, feeling the tension in the air grow thicker with each step. As she neared the door, her thoughts began to spiral. This wasn't just any old find, it was a discovery that could change everything. But would anyone believe her? She had barely made it back into the main area of the bunker when the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, listening intently. The footsteps were deliberate, cautious, not the random noise of an animal or a storm. Someone was here. Without thinking, Kate darted behind a large wooden crate, pressing her back against the cool concrete wall. She held her breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the door to the main room. Kate's eyes flicked toward the opening, where a shadow passed by, just out of sight. She waited, holding her breath, her mind racing. Who was it? Had someone else found the bunker? Or was it someone searching for the treasure, someone who knew exactly what it was? The shadow paused, and then the sound of footsteps moved away, disappearing down the hallway. She exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. She couldn't afford to take chances. Whoever had been lurking around the corner clearly knew about the bunker. But how? Kate took one last look at the room, her eyes lingering on the gold bars before she made her way toward the exit. She wasn't ready to leave it all behind just yet, but she needed a plan, and more importantly, she needed help. Kate couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as she made her way back to her truck. The whole drive back to town was a blur, her mind constantly replaying the images of the gold and the shadowy figure she had seen lurking near the bunker. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white. She had to figure out who else knew about this, and fast. She pulled into the quiet parking lot of her small, cluttered garage. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. She took a moment to steady her nerves before stepping out of the truck. The gold, the weight of it hadn't fully sunk in yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep it to herself. Not when there were others involved. She had to tell someone she could trust. Her first thought was Eddie, an old friend from her mechanic days. He was the kind of person who didn't get caught up in the drama of the world. He liked solving problems, not stirring them up. And most importantly, he was a good guy. If anyone would understand what was at stake here, it was him. She pulled out her phone, dialing his number with shaking hands. The line rang a few times before he picked up. "Kate." Eddie's voice was groggy, like he had just woken up. "What's up? I need you to meet me. It's urgent," she said, her voice firm but tinged with a trace of panic. "I found something big, and I need your help." Eddie didn't question her tone. He had always trusted her instincts. "All right. Where?" "The usual spot." "Give me an hour," she replied, and hung up before he could say anything more. The next hour passed in a blur as Kate quickly packed up some supplies, a few tools, a flashlight, and a first aid kit just in case. She was already thinking ahead, knowing that whatever lay ahead would require more than just a casual inspection. When she arrived at the meeting spot, an old diner on the outskirts of town, Eddie was waiting by his truck. His face lit up when he saw her, but then he noticed the tension in her eyes and the grim set of her jaw. "You're not kidding, huh?" Eddie said, his voice low and cautious. Kate nodded. "We're going to need to get to the bunker. There's something there, something dangerous. I think we might be in over our heads." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "What did you find?" She hesitated for a moment, thinking about how best to explain. But then the image of the gold bars flashed in her mind again, and the cold rush of reality hit her hard. She took a breath. Nazi gold, she said, her voice steady but with an edge of disbelief. I found Nazi gold in an old bunker, and I'm not the only one who knows about it. Eddie's eyes widened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He processed the words, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. You sure about this? He finally asked. I mean, are you absolutely sure? Kate nodded again, this time with more conviction. Yeah, it's real, and I think someone else has been looking for it too. They were there when I was. I'm not sure who, but they were close, too close. Eddie chewed on that for a second, glancing over at the darkened street. The quiet, uneventful life they had built in this small town was being shattered by something bigger than they could have imagined. The stakes had just gone up. All right, let's go, Eddie said, his tone resolute. But you're gonna have to tell me more on the way, and you'd better be right about this. Kate gave him a quick, grim smile. I hope I'm right, Eddie, because if I'm not, we're in deep trouble. Together, they climbed into Eddie's truck, and as they drove toward the bunker, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. What had seemed like a harmless find was now a dangerous game of cat and mouse. They weren't the only ones searching for the gold, and the people looking for it would stop at nothing to get it. The drive to the bunker was long, the moonlight barely making its way through the thick clouds above. The hum of the truck's engine seemed to echo Kate's thoughts, distant, anxious, and never quite still. She kept replaying the moment when she first laid eyes on the gold, her fingers brushing against the cool, shining metal. It had felt surreal at the time, almost like a dream. But now that Eddie knew the truth, everything had shifted. As they neared the outskirts of town, the path to the bunker grew narrower, lined with dense trees and overgrown bushes. Kate knew the way by heart. Now this wasn't her first trip. But tonight felt different. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig under the tires, made her feel as if they were being watched. Eddie didn't speak much on the drive. He kept his eyes on the road, his brow furrowed in concentration. He could tell this was more than just a treasure hunt to Kate. There was something deeper, something she wasn't sharing. Finally, the truck slowed to a stop at the base of the hill, where the old estate sat, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. The bunker was just behind it, hidden away, waiting for someone to discover it. Kate stared at the looming structure, a part of her wondering if she'd made a mistake by dragging Eddie into this. We're here, she said quietly. Eddie glanced over, his face unreadable. How are we getting in? Kate pulled out her flashlight and turned it on, casting a beam over the tangled mess of vines and rusted gates. Same way I did before, she said. But this time, be careful. I'm not sure what we're up against. They stepped out of the truck, their boots crunching on the gravel as they made their way toward the bunker. The air was thick, the ground damp with dew. Every step felt like it took them deeper into something they couldn't escape. Kate's heart beat a little faster as she approached the metal door, the same one she had pried open earlier. But this time, it felt heavier. With a few swift movements, Kate worked the lock open. The door groaned as it swung wide, revealing the cold, dimly lit interior. As they stepped inside, the silence of the bunker swallowed them whole. The musty smell of dust and forgotten history filled the air, and the faint sound of their footsteps was the only thing that broke the stillness. Are you sure about this? Eddie asked, his voice low as he surveyed the room. His eyes fell on the pile of gold, still gleaming under the flickering flashlight. He whistled under his breath. This is real, Kate. This is something straight out of a movie. Kate nodded, her throat tight. I didn't want to believe it either, but it's real. And now someone else knows. We're not alone in this. Eddie's expression darkened. Who else knows? I'm not sure, she said. But when I left the first time, I saw someone lurking near the entrance. Someone who shouldn't have been there. I think they were looking for this just like we are. A chill ran down Kate's spine as she spoke. The thought of someone else hunting for the gold, the thought that someone could be watching them right now made her uneasy. She glanced around, her senses heightened. The air in the bunker felt thicker, almost suffocating. "Let's make this quick," Eddie said, his tone suddenly serious. He was already moving toward the gold, carefully inspecting the bars with a practiced eye. "There's no telling who might come looking for us. We need to get out of here before things get messy." Kate agreed. They had to be careful. The gold was valuable, sure, but there was something even more dangerous about it: its history. The fact that it had been hidden for so long meant that someone wanted it to stay buried, and Kate wasn't sure she wanted to find out who. But just as they began to turn back toward the door, a sound broke the silence, a rustling in the hallway outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was coming. The sound was unmistakable. A soft, deliberate shuffle of footsteps echoing down the narrow hallway outside the bunker. Kate's heart skipped a beat, and she exchanged a glance with Eddie. Both of them instinctively dropped to a crouch, their bodies instinctively moving toward the shadows in the corner of the room. Every muscle tensed, the weight of the gold still heavy on Kate's mind as she fought to control her breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever was out there was coming straight for them. Eddie motioned for Kate to stay low and quiet, his eyes scanning the room for an escape route. They were deep underground, with no windows and only one exit, the metal door through which they had just entered. But that door was still wide open, and whoever was approaching was too close to risk it. The thought of being trapped, surrounded by enemies who might be after the gold, made Kate's stomach turn. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, like prey trapped in a snare. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Kate held her breath, praying they wouldn't be noticed. But then, to her horror, the sound of metal scraping against metal pierced the quiet. Someone was testing the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. They had to act quickly. But how? Eddie, his face hard with resolve, slowly reached for his tool belt. He had a plan, even if Kate wasn't sure what it was. He pulled out a small crowbar, the metal glinting in the dim light. His eyes met hers, silently urging her to stay quiet. Suddenly, there was a loud thud as the door was pushed open, revealing a figure silhouetted in the doorway. The flashlight's beam swept through the room, briefly illuminating the piles of gold before it rested on Kate and Eddie, crouching in the shadows. Kate's breath caught in her throat, her body instinctively freezing. The figure stepped inside, a tall man in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He carried a flashlight of his own, and the beam wavered as he moved deeper into the bunker. He stopped, just inside the door, his eyes scanning the room with unnerving precision. "I know you're in here," he called out, his voice low and calm. "I can hear you breathing. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Kate's mind raced, her body tense with the urge to run, but she held her ground, staying perfectly still. Eddie's grip on the crowbar tightened. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't here for a friendly visit. And the fact that he knew they were hiding meant he'd been following them, or perhaps watching from the shadows for a lot longer than either of them realized. "Come out," the man continued, his voice like cold steel. "I don't want to hurt you, but I'm not leaving without what's mine." Kate's stomach churned. What did he mean by what's mine? Had he been following them since they found the bunker? Or had he been after the gold for years? Suddenly, Eddie made his move. With a swift, fluid motion, he lunged forward, using the crowbar to strike the man's flashlight out of his hand. The room plunged into darkness. The only sounds the crash of the flashlight hitting the floor and the rush of footsteps as Eddie darted for cover. Kate followed suit, her heart racing as she scrambled across the cold concrete floor. Her mind was reeling, the image of the man's face burned into her memory. She didn't know who he was or why he was here, but one thing was clear: he wasn't the only one who knew about the treasure hidden in the bunker. As the silence stretched on, Kate held her breath, waiting for the man to make his next move. Her body was tense, every sense heightened. And then, she heard the sound of metal scraping once again. The door was being closed. The door slammed shut with a reverberating thud, and the dim light from the flashlight left behind flickered out in the darkness. Kate's breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline pumping through her veins as she stood frozen in the shadows. She couldn't afford to waste time. They had to move now. Eddie's voice broke the silence. "We can't stay here. He'll be back with reinforcements. We need to get out, and we need to do it fast." Kate nodded, already sprinting toward the back of the bunker. There was a narrow corridor that led to an emergency exit, one she had noticed when she first explored the place. It was hidden behind a rusted wall panel, but it might just be their ticket out. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the sound of her footsteps felt deafening in the stillness. She glanced over at Eddie, who was already ahead of her, his eyes darting around the dark space. They were on the clock. If the man outside hadn't already called for backup, he would soon. They couldn't take that risk. They reached the back of the bunker, and Eddie wasted no time pulling the old wall panel open, revealing the narrow escape tunnel. The stale air that came from the passageway was thick and suffocating, but it was their only chance. Kate was the first to slip through, followed closely by Eddie. The tunnel was cramped, barely wide enough for them to move comfortably, but they pushed forward, their hands brushing against the damp walls as they made their way deeper into the darkness. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours as they crawled through the narrow passage. The sound of their breath echoed off the walls, a constant reminder that they weren't alone in this. The gold, the discovery, it was all too big for just them. Someone else was hunting for it, and they weren't about to let Kate and Eddie walk away with it. Finally, the tunnel began to widen, the cramped space giving way to a small, hidden room. Kate exhaled in relief, but it was short-lived. Her eyes quickly scanned the room for any signs of danger. There were no windows, no clear exit, just a dead end. The only way out was back the way they came. But then Eddie's voice cut through the tension. "We're not alone." Kate's eyes snapped to him. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing in the stillness of the tunnel. They were close. Too close. The man had found them. With no time to think, Eddie grabbed Kate's arm, pulling her toward a small alcove at the side of the room. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, holding their breath as the footsteps drew nearer. Kate's heart was racing again, but this time, it wasn't just from fear. It was from the terrifying realization that they were being hunted. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. Kate's pulse thundered in her ears as she waited, her eyes locked on Eddie, who was staring at the door, prepared to act. The door creaked open slowly, and a shadow filled the entrance. Kate's mind was spinning. There was no way they could fight this man off, not here, not now. They needed a plan. They needed to escape, and fast. But before she could move, the man's voice broke through the silence once again. "I know you're in here. You can't hide forever." Kate's stomach dropped as the reality of the situation set in. They weren't just dealing with a random person, they were dealing with someone who had been tracking them, hunting them for this gold, this treasure that could change everything. And now, the chase was on. Kate's mind raced as the man's shadow lingered at the doorway. She held her breath, willing her body to stay still, to make no sound. Eddie's grip on her arm tightened, urging her to stay quiet. The man outside wasn't just a threat. He was the key to the next phase of this deadly game. For a few moments, everything was still. The silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the distant drip of water from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. Kate could feel the cold stone wall against her back, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps had stopped, but the man hadn't left. And then, she heard a soft chuckle. "I'm not stupid, you know," the man said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I've been following you for days. You didn't think I wouldn't catch up, did you?" Kate's stomach churned, and she barely stopped herself from gasping. This wasn't just an ordinary treasure hunter. It was someone who knew exactly who they were dealing with. Someone with resources. Someone who had planned this for far too long. Eddie's grip on the crowbar tightened, but Kate shook her head ever so slightly. They weren't ready for a confrontation, not yet. They needed a way out, not a fight. She scanned the room. The alcove they were hidden in was small, just a nook in the stone, but there was an old, rusted grate in the floor. It wasn't much, but it was something. She motioned to Eddie, who followed her gaze. The grate might be their escape. Without hesitation, Kate dropped to her knees and began pulling at the rusty bars. They creaked loudly, protesting against her efforts. The man was still standing just outside the door, too close for comfort. Kate pushed harder, her fingers slipping on the grime-covered metal. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she cursed under her breath. "You're wasting your time," the man called out, his voice smug. "There's no way out, not unless you want to meet your end down here." But Kate didn't listen. She couldn't. The sound of the man's taunting laughter was driving her to the edge. She yanked harder, and with a final desperate tug, the grate gave way. It fell to the side with a heavy thud, echoing through the tunnel. Without thinking, Kate crawled into the narrow hole, her body moving instinctively. Eddie followed closely behind her, his eyes flicking back toward the door one last time before he squeezed through. They were in darkness now, the only light coming from their flashlights. The space beneath the floor was cramped, a crawl space filled with dirt and debris, but it was a way out. Kate moved quickly, her body brushing against the rough stone as she scrambled through the tunnel beneath the bunker. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and earth, but it was better than the alternative being caught by the man who was chasing them. Behind her, Eddie whispered, "We need to get out of here now." Kate didn't answer. She just moved faster, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the tunnel stretched on. She had no idea where it would lead, but at this point, it didn't matter, as long as it was away from him. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing at places, then opening into a wider section. It was like a labyrinth, a hidden network of pathways that Kate had never known existed. She had no idea how long the tunnel had been here, or how far it stretched, but it felt like she was being swallowed by the earth itself. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. The walls were damp, and water trickled down them, pooling on the floor. Kate stopped, her flashlight sweeping across the room. There was a small opening on the far side, an exit, just big enough for them to crawl through. She turned to Eddie, panting, her mind still racing. "We go through there, and we don't stop. Understand?" Eddie nodded, his expression grim. "We're not out of the woods yet." They moved toward the opening, and Kate could hear the sound of footsteps again, this time from behind them, coming from the entrance of the tunnel. The man had followed them, but this time they were ahead. They crawled through the small gap in the wall, the rough edges of stone scraping against their clothes and skin. The opening led them into a dense thicket of trees, the air suddenly fresh as they emerged into the night. Kate stood, looking back toward the bunker, then at Eddie. "We're not safe yet," she said, breathless, her voice low. Eddie nodded. "I know, but we have a lead now, and we can't let him catch up." The cold air seemed to bite at their skin as they turned to face the dark woods ahead of them. They had no idea where the tunnel led, but one thing was clear: they couldn't stop running now. The engine's roar echoed through the trees, a reminder that they weren't alone in the woods. Kate's heart pounded as they pushed forward, her mind whirling with the thought of what would happen if they were caught. The gold wasn't just valuable, it was a beacon for danger. Eddie glanced over at her, his face hardening. "We need to get to the cabin, now." Kate didn't need any more convincing. She pressed on, every branch and twig cracking beneath her feet as they hurried deeper into the dense forest. The truck was closing in, and she had no intention of letting it catch up. Through the trees, the outline of the cabin finally came into view. It was old, forgotten, but it was their best chance for safety. Kate's legs burned, but she pushed herself harder, urging Eddie to keep up. They reached the cabin's door, just as the truck screeched to a halt behind them. Eddie fumbled with the handle, panic seeping into his voice. "Kate, help me!" Kate ripped the door open with the crowbar, her hands shaking. "In now," she ordered, pushing Eddie inside. They slammed the door shut, just as footsteps echoed on the gravel behind them. The cabin's walls were thin, the silence heavy. The man outside was closing in. "We're not safe yet," Kate whispered, pressing her back to the wall. "We need a plan." Eddie looked around the room, trying to calm himself. "We're not staying here long," Kate nodded, her mind already working. We need to figure out who they are and what they really want. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin as Kate and Eddie huddled in the dark. The man outside was getting closer, but Kate couldn't afford to panic. She had to think, had to act. "I'm going back to the bunker," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. Eddie's eyes widened. "What? Are you crazy? They'll be waiting for us." "I know," Kate replied, her jaw tightening. "But we have to understand who's behind this. Why they're after the gold. We can't just run." Eddie ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "You're right, but I'm not letting you go alone." Kate shook her head. "I'm not asking for permission. We'll go together, but only if you're ready for what comes next. This isn't just a treasure hunt anymore. We're dealing with something far bigger." Eddie paused, his mind working through the implications. "All right. We go in, we get answers, and then we get out. But we move fast." They gathered what little gear they had. Flashlights, tools, anything that could help, and crept out of the cabin, staying low. The forest was thick with darkness, but their resolve was clear. They had no choice but to return to the bunker. The truth was buried there, and they were going to dig it up no matter the cost. The trip back to the bunker was a tense one. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle in the trees had Kate's nerves on edge. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. As they neared the bunker, Kate's heart raced. The sound of distant voices drifted toward them from the darkened woods. Someone was waiting. Someone who knew they were coming. "They found us," Eddie muttered under his breath. "What now?" Kate gritted her teeth. "We keep moving. We can't let them get the upper hand." They reached the entrance of the bunker, the metal door still hanging open from their earlier escape. Kate motioned for Eddie to stay back while she peered inside. The room was still, eerily silent, too quiet. She stepped in, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark space. The gold bars were still there, untouched. But now, everything felt different. The treasure wasn't the only thing at stake anymore. They were in a race against time. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was him, the man who had been hunting them. His eyes gleamed in the dark, filled with a mix of satisfaction and menace. "Did you really think you could escape?" he sneered. Kate's pulse quickened. "We're not running anymore. We're done hiding." Eddie grabbed the crowbar from his side. "Let's end this." The standoff was inevitable. The hunt had come full circle. And now, Kate and Eddie had to make their stand.